Nike does not make shoes. It never has. Every sneaker with a swoosh on it is manufactured by a contractor in Vietnam, Indonesia, or China. Workers Nike does not employ. In factories Nike does not own, using equipment Nike has never purchased. And yet Nike is worth over $80 billion, controls nearly 40% of the global athletic footwear market, and built one of the most recognized logos on earth for $35. This is not a story about shoes. It is a story about what happens when a company realizes it is not in the product business at all, it is an identity business. Start at the beginning, because the beginning is the part that changes everything. Phil Knight was a middle distance runner at the University of Oregon in the late 1950s. Trained by a coach named Bill Bowerman, who had a lifelong obsession with making athletes faster by making their shoes lighter. Knight wrote a paper in business school arguing that Japanese manufacturing could do to athletic shoes what it had already done to cameras. Undercut the American and German market on price without sacrificing quality. After graduating, he flew to Japan, walked into the offices of a shoe company called Onitsuka Tiger, and told them that he represented a distribution company called Blue Ribbon Sports. That company did not exist. He invented it in the meeting. Onitsuka gave him the American distribution rights anyway. Knight came home and started selling Tigers out of the trunk of his car at track meets. Bowerman joined as a partner, and the two of them spent the next decade building a distribution business they did not own, selling a product they did not make, to an audience they were learning to understand from the ground up. This is the first and most important piece of the Nike blueprint. Knight did not start by building a shoe. He started by building a relationship with an audience. He knew runners before he knew manufacturing. He understood what they wanted, what they talked about, and what they trusted. And he used that to understand and position himself between the product and the customer before he ever controlled the product at all. The split with Onitsuka came in 1971. Knight and Bowerman needed their own brand. A design student named Caroline Davidson was paid $35 to sketch a logo. She handed them the Swoosh. They named the company after the Greek goddess of victory. Nike launched the same year with shoes manufactured by the same contractors they had already been working with, except now the brand on the shoe was theirs. Here is what this means for the business model. From day one, Nike was structured as a marketing and design company that happened to sell shoes, not a manufacturing company that happened to market them. The factories were always someone else's problem. Nike's job was to figure out who the customer wanted to be, and then sell them the version of themselves that wore a Nike shoe. Most companies discover this positioning by accident, after years of trying to compete on product quality. Nike built it from the start because the founders never owned a factory to get attached to. Now let's talk about the move that turned a running shoe brand into a cultural institution, because this is where the business model reaches a completely different level. In 1984, Nike was struggling. Adidas and Converse dominated basketball. Nike had almost no presence in the sport. The company identified a rookie out of North Carolina named Michael Jordan as someone worth betting on, and offered him an endorsement deal unlike anything that existed in sports at the time. Jordan wanted Adidas. His mother convinced him to hear Nike out. Nike offered $250,000 per year, more than any rookie had ever been paid for an endorsement, plus royalties on every shoe sold under his name. The royalty clause was the part that nobody in the industry had done before. The goal for the first Air Jordan was $3 million in sales in the first year. The shoe generated $126 million. Nike had not just signed an athlete, they had signed a mirror. Every person who bought an Air Jordan was not buying a shoe. They were buying proximity to the version of themselves that could do what Michael Jordan did. They were buying an identity, and Nike had figured out how to charge retail markup for it. The Jordan deal established a template for everything that followed. Nike began systematically acquiring the most aspirational athletes in every sport and turning them into identity anchors for the brand. Tiger Woods in golf, Serena Williams in tennis, Cristiano Ronaldo, and later LeBron James. Each partnership was not just a marketing arrangement, it was a signal to every person in the athlete's orbit about who Nike shoes were for, and importantly, who you could become wearing them. This is the engine underneath the entire business. Nike does not compete on cushioning or sole technology or material science, though it invests in all of those. Nike competes on aspiration. The product is the proof point. The brand is the actual product. And because the brand lives in the customer's minds rather than in the factory or supply chain, it is almost impossible for a competitor to copy. Now, let's look at how the financial model actually works, because the numbers reveal something most people miss entirely. Nike's revenue is over $50 billion annually. Its gross margin consistently runs between 44 and 46%. meaning for every dollar of revenue, Nike keeps nearly half before operating expenses. That margin is almost unheard of for a company selling physical goods at mass scales. The reason is that the asset-light model, Nike does not carry the capital burden of manufacturing. No factories to maintain, no production equipment to replace, no workers to employ at scale. The contractors absorb all of that. Nike keeps the brand, the design, and the distribution relationship, the three parts of the value chain with the highest margin and the lowest capital requirement. The Jordan brand alone now generates over $5 billion in annual revenue and operates as a separate business unit inside Nike. It is, by itself, one of the most valuable sneaker brands on earth, built entirely on the back of one endorsement deal signed 40 years ago with a player who wanted Adidas. Here is where the compounding gets interesting. Nike's direct-to-consumer strategy, accelerated significantly in recent years, is designed to do to retailers what Amazon did to third-party merchants. Make them useful while steadily reducing their leverage. When Nike sells through its own app, its own website, and its own stores, it captures the full retail margin instead of splitting it with a middleman. It also captures the customer data, who is buying what they are buying, how often they come back, what language converts them. The data feeds into this design and marketing cycle, making the next product more precisely targeted than the last one. Every Nike app download is a direct relationship with a customer that no retailer can interrupt. Every app exclusive drop creates scarcity that makes the brand feel more premium. Every athlete partnership adds another identity anchor that makes someone somewhere feel like Nike is the shoe for the version of themselves they are trying to become. It is a flywheel. Athlete partnerships drive aspiration. Aspiration drives demand. Demand drives revenue. Revenue funds the next athlete partnership and the next product cycle. The factories keep making the shoes and Nike keeps on making the meaning. So what can you actually take from this? The first takeaway is that the product is rarely the business. Nike's product is a rubber and foam shoe assembled by contractors in Southeast Asia. Nike's business is selling the feeling of being the person who wears that shoe. Every company that has built a durable premium brand has made this same shift, from selling a thing to selling an identity. Apple doesn't sell computers, it sells the identity of a creative person. Lululemon doesn't sell yoga pants, it sells the identity of someone who has their life together. Find the identity your product enables and sell that instead of the product. The second takeaway is that the asset-light model is a competitive moat, not just a cost advantage. Because Nike doesn't own factories, it can shift production between countries as labor costs change, scale up or down without carrying fixed overhead, and redeploy capital into brand building instead of equipment. The less physical infrastructure a company owns, the more flexible and resilient it tends to be. The companies that got wiped out by manufacturing disruption in the last decade were the ones who confused owning production with controlling it. The third takeaway is what the Jordan deal teaches about asymmetric bets. Nike paid $250,000 a year for a player nobody was certain would succeed. The downside was limited. The upside was uncapped because of the royalty structure. Most business price their partnerships as expenses, a fixed cost with a predictable return. Nike structured Jordan as an equity stake in a person. The royalty clause meant that the better Jordan performed, the more Nike made, without any additional investment. Find the version of that bet in your own business. The partnership or the experiment where the downside is controlled and the upside compounds. The fourth takeaway is the power of distribution ownership. Nike spent decades selling through retailers and watching those retailers capture margin, data, and customer relationship that rightfully belong to Nike. The direct-to-consumer shift is essentially a reclamation project, taking back the relationship with the customer that the wholesale model had outsourced. Whatever business you are in, the closest you can get to the end customer, the more leverage you have over your own growth. Every middleman in your chain is a margin you don't capture and a relationship you don't own. Phil Knight started with a paper, a made-up company name, and a flight to Japan. He spent 6 years selling someone else's shoes out of a trunk of his car before he put the swoosh on anything. He didn't build a shoe company. He built an identity machine that happens to put its logo on shoes. And 60 years later, that $35 logo is one of the most valuable marks in the history of commerce. You don't need a factory. You need to know who your customer wants to become.